Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of some of my recent reading. I have to catch up, so I think I may end up editing some of this out because I have a few things where I don't have much to say. Alright, I'm going to start with a book that I did not enjoy at all, and that is Ayad Akhtar's Disgraced. This won the Pulitzer Prize in 2013, and I'm baffled as to why. It's sold as being a retelling of Othello, of Othello, Shakespeare's play, not the opera. But what it really is a play in the style of, and anybody who follows non-musical theater has seen plays like this, which is obnoxious, rich New Yorkers arguing with each other over a dinner at a dinner party. That's what this is. There are two couples who are both, what would you say, interfaith and interracial couples, although of 4 different backgrounds. And several of them work together in a law firm, and one of them is not going to get the promotion that he wants, and he's going to beat his wife at the end. And it's so cliche. And it's theatrical in that obnoxiously theatrical way where you think people don't talk like that. Sometimes people think things that might be in line with that. People may say some of these things in more offensive or less offensive ways, but the way everybody talks in that was ridiculous. I thought it was trash. I hated it. The characters are intentionally unlikable. You are reading this and thinking all of these people are awful, and they are awful, but not in a way that's intriguing. I think there are so many works that deal with unlikable people, and the people are unlikable in ways that at least interest you, that make you think, ah, yes, I can see why they became that way, or ah, yes, I can understand why their evil plan is whatever. Nobody has an evil plan in that. That's way more interesting. And the author clearly thinks he's saying something deep about xenophobia and Islamophobia and sexism and anti-Semitism and a bunch of things, but genuinely, it struck me as being cheap garbage, and it won the Pulitzer Prize. I found it infuriating. I'll also talk about the best thing that I think I've read over this last period, and that is this work of autofiction, My Heart, by Semezdin Mehmedinović. This is really clearly a memoir and not fiction, although it does have the subheading, a novel. In the first third of this, the author tells us about a time when he had a heart attack and was grappling with his own mortality. In the final section, he is dealing with his wife experiencing memory loss after a stroke, and the middle section is him and his son on a road trip across the United States in 2015, and thinking about the present and the past and being in exile and the way in which he and his son have differently dealt with, that's not English, have dealt differently with their own memories of having lived through the siege of Sarajevo, because his son had been young at the time and he was an adult who was making the choices for them, and how those things differ. Now, what I thought was really interesting about this is because earlier this year I had read 2 of the author's poetry collections, one of which, Sarajevo Blues, was specifically poetry written during the siege of Sarajevo, and then 9 Alexandrias, which was written 5 years after they moved to the US and is about a train trip across the US. And so this felt almost like a sequel to those 2 poetry collections. So Jen from Insert Literary Pun Here did a review of this that is a review of the book on its own, and I'll link to that below, because I think experiencing this as a book on its own as opposed to a sequel to these poetry collections, which were also memoir-esque, I don't know if that's a better way to react to a work, but it is a very different way to react to this, because I did read this essentially feeling like I was catching up with his family stories. I did think, interestingly, also, his son Harun is quite a famous photographer and cinematographer in his own right, and has a TED Talk in which he talks about his war memories. And the way he talks about it is sort of at odds with what his father says about his memories, looking at it from like an external perspective, the parent looking at the child. So I will link to the video of that below, because I think that's really interesting, just as a contrast, because in here, the author comments on how he feels like his son has repressed all of these memories, and you watch the TED Talk and it's about his war memories. So yeah, I thought this was brilliant, but not as brilliant as the poetry. I liked the poetry better, but I feel like that's because the poetry just is what it is, not exactly fiction, not exactly memoir, whereas this is autofiction, so it exists in that zone where I feel like it's pretending not to be essentially a sequel to these poetry collections when it so clearly is. Either way, this was fantastic. I thought it was great. 100% recommended. The only negative I would have is that Celia Hawkesworth, who translated this, occasionally uses quite British expressions. And under normal circumstances, if this was a book that was set in Bosnia and not set in the United States, I would say, who cares? It doesn't matter if it's British English, American English, Canadian, Australian English, whatever. However, because this is set in the US, and this is set at a point where the family had lived in the US for almost 20 years, you do think if he'd written this in English, he would have written it in American English and not British English, and it is weird to have it in British English. Not to an extreme level, and I think maybe some people won't even notice that, but I did find it jarring a couple of times where she would pick a phrase and I would think, especially when he's describing things in the final section where he's talking about different parts of Georgetown and different parts of Northern Virginia and DC that I've lived in and been in and hung around with a bunch of immigrants and refugees and expats, etc., who live there, who do generally speak more American English, even if what they learned in school was British English. So yeah, I found that slightly jarring, but that's very much a your mileage may vary thing, and also it didn't really matter. The book is fantastic. All right, let's talk about some nonfiction next. That is also sort of about the experience of not exile in the same way, but removal from the homeland, because that's what my heart is also dealing with at its core, which I don't think I mentioned. And this is Kazim Ali's Northern Light, Power, Land, and the Memory of Water. This is interesting. I went to one of the virtual sessions of the Eden Mills Writers Festival, and this author was speaking there, and he commented that he originally started out planning to write a memoir of his childhood because he grew up in a really small town when his father was working on a hydro project in northern Manitoba. And that when he did research into it, he found out what that hydro project had done to the First Nations community that was on the other side of the lake that the dam was being built on. And so the book becomes kind of an exploration of both the cultural shifts and the power dynamics in rural areas in Canada, also with memory and what it means to have had memories of something that wasn't exactly the way you remembered it, because as a child you just don't have the context for things like that. So this was super interesting. The author was born in the UK. His parents were from India and Pakistan, and he moved to Canada at a very young age, and then as a teenager they moved to the US, and he spent most of his adult life in the US. So he talks about essentially he was looking for home and like, do I have a hometown? And it was going to be this village that doesn't exist anymore in northern Manitoba. And what he finds instead is this horrific story about what this hydro dam did to this community. And then he finds out about the suicide epidemics and the missing people and residential schools and whatnot. And it's interesting because he is both working through something that's in a lot of Canadian media now, but as someone who has spent his entire adult life in the US, is exploring it as an outsider and an insider simultaneously. And an insider in the sense of being a settler Canadian as opposed to being First Nations, because obviously that would be a different story as well. Because the book became more things as it went on, it does occasionally not feel like it's gelling completely, but I think that's kind of interesting in and of itself, because it is this kind of experiment in memory not being what you expect it to be, especially when your immigration history is specifically tied to a kind of natural resource project like that. Because I think a lot of people's immigration stories are tied to, we moved for a better life, whereas this is clearly tied to, we moved to work on this hydro project, and that did this additional damage in addition to being just generically a settler. So unlike being a kind of generic settler on Indigenous land, you are kind of intrinsically tied to the environmental and social damage, because this is specifically why you ended up there, which I found really interesting, especially personally, because my father was in the mining industry and my ex-husband was in oil and gas. And so my own migration patterns, both as a child and as an adult, and people sometimes comment on, I talk about how I've lived a lot of places, and it's because of doing environmental damage, which is an interesting way to think about your own life. And so I appreciated the process of that, but yeah, it doesn't always 100% gel, but I think that is interesting. Next up, I'm going to jump topics completely and mention a book that is kind of a guidebook that does not say it's written for a younger audience, but it feels like it should be written for a younger audience. And this is Emily Ladau's Demystifying Disability: What to Know, What to Say, and How to Be an Ally. This is a book that As I said, I've seen on a lot of disability-related social media, and it's being presented as a book for a fairly broad and a wide audience, but it does feel like something that you would want to have in a high school library, because it is very 101 and very introductory. And the author is in some ways, I think, too careful at being not necessarily overly inclusive, because that wouldn't be a bad thing, but if you were doing a very broad overview and you talk about 100 different things, let's say, rather than 50 different things or 10 different things, the overview is going to be so broad, you can't get into anything granular. So it felt very broad and very general in a way that I didn't think would have worked as well as something that is digging down into something more specific. She opens up by talking, for example, about language and person first versus identity language, which is something I've talked about before. Not a fan of the person first language. But because she has to then deal with all these different communities at what ends up being a fairly shallow way, it turns into something where she says she prefers one, but she's using the other more often, and that doesn't get explained because there isn't time to explain that. There's a historical overview. It's a very American overview. Yeah, that is the other thing. This is a very US-focused book, which again is not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, but it is being marketed as something broader, and it's not if you're in any other part of the Anglosphere. If you're in a non-Anglophone country, this doesn't apply in the same way. It is a perfectly fine overview. If you were stocking, say, a high school library, this would be a great addition to that library because it does feel like something that would be a starting point. And it does have links to other books and to other research and things, although a lot of the other books it references are memoirs, which, again, are good starting points, but I don't know. I feel like there have been a lot of decent introductory books, and this is just not quite as good as some of them. I think Alice Wong's Disability Visibility and the book that collected the New York Times disability column, both of those I think are far better introductory books than this is for an adult audience. But for a teenage audience, I do think this has a definite place, but the marketing, not the best for that, because it would lead you to think that it is something more than it is. So those are some of the things that I have read lately. I think I'm maybe going to take a break here and put some of the stuff that would fit with the Latinx-a-thon in a different video. So we'll talk about that later. In any case, if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought. Do you hate New York rich people having dinner plays as much as I do? And do you have a favorite work of autofiction? Those are my questions du jour. Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.